Welcome back. So tonight's episode is going to be a bit like the previous three episodes where it's just me talking. And it's not my preferred format, but there are going to be future episodes coming up where it's going to be back to the typical format where I'm having conversations with people. But occasionally, I think it's important to get out some topics that I don't often find the opportunity to present when I'm talking to somebody. So, as I mentioned in the previous episode, tonight's episode was supposed to primarily be about our chemical dependence in the petrochemical lobby. And I don't really feel like I have gone in depth enough in my research and my reading to really do that topic justice, but I'm still going to share some stories that I have really found quite fascinating related to um, the Gulf oil spill and the use of Corexit, um, to Times Beach and the spraying of dioxin, as well as a couple other things, particularly Silent Spring by Rachel Carson. So I guess I'll get started by saying that I'm really interested in talking about different industries and different instances of corruption. I think that every institution that we have is corrupt in some way, but people who are in the position to say something about that, people who work within those institutions or industries, don't say anything or won't say anything because they fear for their reputation, they fear for retaliation, they feel for they fear for their reputations, they fear for retaliation, and they fear for losing their jobs. And it doesn't really matter if the institution is considered more on the left side or the right side, but police, government, corporations, Hollywood, the academia, the war on drugs, the military-industrial complex. I have a whole list of them back on that poster right there, and all of them are something that I want to hit at some point. Oh, the Catholic Church. So, all of our institutions are wounded in some way. Education, oof, don't even get me started on that. And big chemical is one of them. Big pharma is another. And I think that there's connections between a lot of these different styles of corruption. And it's sort of like a giant web. And recently I had the satisfaction of learning about how the pharmaceutical big pharma lobby is connected to petrochemicals. When I say petrochemicals, that's one branch of chemicals. Petrochemicals are derived from oil. So they're sort of the byproducts, and plastics are also derived from oil. But one thing that I heard a couple podcasts back when I was interviewing a guy who happens to be a hemp lobbyist down in Tennessee, he was saying that the petrochemical companies lobbied hard against hemp and the continued criminalization of marijuana because otherwise hemp would be used for its fibers in the production of rope. And without hemp, the petrochemical companies could then use plastics to create rope and other things that hemp would otherwise be used for. So it reminded me of what the sugar lobby was doing to put all the negative attention on fat and how that shaped the American diet and the agricultural practices of the country. So one of the big interesting stories that I had heard of recently and referenced in a previous podcast was how I was reading the book Pharma by Gerald Posner, who I had on a previous podcast, and then the book The Pharmacist of Auschwitz by his wife, Tricia Posner, who I also had on a previous podcast. And essentially, in The Pharmacist of Auschwitz, Tricia talks about how in Germany there was a series of camps, 3 large camps called Auschwitz. I'm sure you've heard of it, where right nearby was built a factory by the German pharmaceutical firm IG Farben, and they actually used labor directly from Auschwitz. They made a deal with the German Nazi government, and they also, as part of that deal, were able to practice using their creations, their pharmaceuticals, in guinea pig tests, basically on people that were in that camp. So IG Farben, one of its subsidiaries, created a chemical called Zyklon, and the Nazi government contacted that subsidiary and asked that they change the label and switch it from a pesticide. Well, actually, they just basically repurpose it and to remove the pesticide instructions from the label, as far as I understand, and to up the production of it. And that's what they ultimately used in the final solution, in the gas chambers. And a couple weeks later, I was having a conversation with a friend who brought up, this friend happens to be Indian, and he brought up a video of an Indian woman who was talking on a, I believe, French news channel about the use of pesticides in India and how American billionaires like Bill Gates, through the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation, encourage the use of pesticides for agriculture. They're sort of, in what she was saying, continuing the work of big companies like Monsanto. And what really caught my attention was she talks about how a lot of people don't realize that a lot of these agricultural chemicals have their origins in Nazi Germany. And I found that fascinating because it connects pharma and big pharma and big chemical, and essentially says that as the war neared its end, a lot of these firms that produce these chemicals had to risk basically going bankrupt if their chemical weapons were just completely discontinued. So these companies had to come up with new uses of their chemicals in more everyday life. And one of the biggest opportunities was to switch over to agricultural chemicals, same formulations, now branded as agricultural chemicals. That's pretty interesting. So that drew my attention more to the chemical industry and the chemical lobby. Okay, so a couple interesting stories. The first one was a couple years back. Remember the whole BP oil spill in the Gulf with the Deepwater Horizon oil well exploding? I should say oil rig exploding. Well, there was a chemical produced at the same factory that happened to produce Agent Orange, which was the defoliant that Americans dropped on the jungles of Vietnam during the Vietnam War, which eventually led to all kinds of birth defects generations later in Vietnam, and it's still going on today. There was a chemical produced more recently after the Deepwater Horizon explosion called Corexit. And the purpose of Corexit was to effectively sink the oil so that it wasn't all floating on the surface of the water, because it's very difficult, from what I gather, to actually clean up an oil spill. So they threw, I think they sprayed this chemical Corexit in the Gulf, and it actually caused everything kind of to clump together, and it caused people to get chemical burns on them when they came into contact with Corexit. So there's a really interesting Vice mini documentary about that from a couple years back. You might be able to find it on YouTube. Just search Vice, and once again, the chemical name is Corexit, Corexit. And Vice is very hit or miss for me. Sometimes I really like what they're doing. Sometimes they completely botch it, or they're just totally not doing their due diligence with the given topic. But in this case, I thought they did a pretty good job. Okay, so another fascinating story is related to Times Beach. And I first heard about this story through a podcast called Outside In, which talks about the environment a lot, but in very interesting ways. It's not just sort of like a harping, naggy, hey, environmentalist, we need to do more type thing. It's just, it expresses different aspects of the environment, and it's quite interesting, shorter episodes. And you can find that on Spotify, and I'm not sure if you can find it on other platforms. But this episode happened to be about Times Beach, and that is in Missouri. And I think it was maybe about 50 years ago. Could have been longer than that. But I guess this used to be a wider practice. During the summer months when dirt roads would dry out and get dusty, they would spray motor oil on the roads to keep the dust down. And in Times Beach, Missouri, this year being the year way back when, the guy that was responsible for doing that, the groundskeeper, I suppose, happened to find some barrels of an unknown chemical, which happened to be dioxin, which is the main chemical component, the main toxic component in Agent Orange, once again. And previously there was an Agent Orange plant actually near Times Beach, which is why there were these barrels nearby. And so this groundskeeper said, I'm just going to mix it with the oil and spray it on the roads. So he unknowingly sprayed the roads down with a highly toxic chemical, and the townspeople going about their business, enjoying life during the summer, walked all over those roads, biked all over those roads, drove their cars over those roads. It was a public health disaster. They had to shut the whole town down and effectively bury it. It became a Superfund site. If you don't know what that is, you should check out the Environmental Protection Agency's website and check out the list of Superfund sites. These are effectively locations that have been so rendered so toxic that they must be cleaned up before they can be used in some capacity, or humans can walk on them. And actually today, Times Beach has been turned into a park, which is kind of ironic. They had forced everybody decades ago to leave, to abandon it. Kind of reminds me of those stories where they will they'll allow the dam to break and completely engulf a town and create a reservoir where a town was. So Times Beach is quite an interesting story. I'd never heard of that before. And that was really the first Superfund site that I learned about in detail. So the EPA is an organization that I'm divided on. I think that they exist for a very important purpose, but I imagine that it's full of a ton of bureaucracy and regulations that probably don't make much sense or aren't entirely effective. But it also bugs me that politicians try to cut EPA regulations across the board without knowing what they do. Tangentially related to that topic, there's a book called The Fifth Risk by Michael Lewis, where he talks about the transition from the Obama to the Trump administrations and how there are 3 departments that were effectively left unstaffed or understaffed. It was energy, agriculture, and commerce, and how maybe libertarian, conservative type voters and politicians believe that those departments didn't really do much or were just massive bureaucracies. And I'm sure they are large bureaucracies, but they're also extremely important. And one of the things that the Department of Energy does that a lot of people don't realize is that they take care of old nuclear sites. So there's one out in Washington State that has to constantly be maintained in these underground silos that have nuclear material, and contaminated dirt have to be covered and there needs to be some regular maintenance on this site. And when that department was understaffed, that site was understaffed. And so it kind of put us all at risk. Okay, the third stories that I wanted to tell about chemicals were related to Rachel Carson. And so if you haven't heard of Silent Spring, Rachel Carson was the one who wrote a popular book exposing the use of herbicides and pesticides back in the 60s. And it was really the inspiration for the creation of the Environmental Protection Agency, ironically under the Nixon administration, because a lot of people don't exactly think that environmental protectionism meshes with Nixon or Nixon's politics. And so she talks about things like pyrethrins, chlordane, methoxychlor, chlorinated hydrocarbons, all these terms that you probably haven't heard before. I hadn't heard before I listened to the book, the audio book. And she talks about how even compounds and chemicals that are considered safe for humans to either consume or to be in contact with in some small amount, it's unclear what the combined effect of all of these different chemicals are within the human body and within the environment. So we had this mixing effect of all of the chemicals that were being used. And I recently saw myself when I was helping my aunt and uncle and mom to clean up my grandparents' place, the amount of chemicals that exist, particularly in the garages and the basements of the Greatest Generation and probably a lot of boomers as well. And you've probably heard of the Roundup controversy where weed killers are just atrocious for the environment, and they get into runoff, which goes into rivers. And it's not just runoff from suburban lawns, but agricultural runoff, the use of Roundup and pesticides. And oh man, it's so really the agricultural use of chemicals is what brought it into an entirely different scale. I was reading recently about how this was in a book called Deadliest Enemy, about the development of different pathogens and germs and outbreaks, and very interesting, written by an epidemiologist from University of Minnesota, I want to say. He was also on the Joe Rogan podcast. And he was talking about how the spraying campaigns to get rid of mosquitoes were actually, they used certain pesticides like DEET or DDT, I believe it was DDT. And they were pretty effective at getting rid of certain vector-borne diseases and getting rid of certain types of mosquitoes that carried those diseases. And it was really once agriculture started to pick up and use spraying that it became much more toxic to the environment. The smaller campaigns for public health, although there is that trade-off where it is a chemical that doesn't have the best, if a human were to come into contact with a concentrated form of it, it wouldn't be a good thing. In those small dispersed sprayings, it wasn't actually that much of a risk to public health. But the result of agricultural use and Silent Spring caused it to be abandoned altogether, and therefore vector-borne illnesses through mosquitoes have become pretty rampant again, which is unfortunate. Now, Rachel Carson, I think, needs to be more of a household name, and what she did was pretty phenomenal. She drew attention to something that people really paid no attention to, and not just agricultural use, but like I was talking about before, consumer use. So after World War II, I've talked about this before, a lot of the companies that had increased production because of the war demands had to figure out ways to continue to make money and to continue that degree of income. And so a lot of them switched over to marketing their products for consumers like you and I, average people. And that was really the birth of consumerism and Madison Avenue and marketing things towards people that they didn't really need, but creating a sense of insecurity in people and then promoting a product through advertisements that said that that insecurity or that hole would be filled and they would be satisfied if they bought that product. All of that began in this era. And so you got people buying all kinds of different things to fill their homes with, their new fancy suburban homes that a lot of people lived in at the time. And along with those belongings came a legion of chemicals to maintain those belongings. I was just looking at a lot of these chemicals in my grandparents' garage before we got rid of them on the hazardous waste disposal day. And you would get waxes and polishes of all sorts, everything for furniture, for floors, for anything metal. It was crazy. And there were it seemed like there were no two polishes that could be used on similar things, metal things. It was always like there was a silver polish, a brass polish, a bronze polish, whatever. So I hope that there's a resurgence of interest in Rachel Carson, but another name that you should research is Erin Brockovich. You've probably heard of that movie with Julia Roberts. She's actually a real person. In the movie, she goes against a company that was dumping, I think it was chromium-10 near civilians, and they were getting sick. And so there was a class action lawsuit against this company. So Erin Brockovich, check her out as well. And I think that's pretty much it for chemicals tonight. So I'm going to pivot over, probably not too gracefully, into some other topics. And one of the topics that I had really wanted to talk about was, I term it the Ponzi borrow. And it relates to what I was just talking about with the era just after World War II, and how that has really set up all of the following decades that define the lives of boomers, Gen X, millennials, Gen Z. So here's a little finance lesson, a mini one. There are 3 different types of borrowing. Maybe there's more, but for the sake of this argument, 3 primary types. One of them is hedge borrowing, one of them is speculative borrowing, one of them is Ponzi borrowing. So hedge borrowing is when you borrow money knowing that you have the capacity to pay back the principal and the interest. The principal, if you're not familiar with finance, being the loan amount, and the interest being the amount you owe on that loan as you pay it back over time, the additional amount of money that you pay for the convenience of the loan. And speculative borrowing, the second type, is when you borrow money and know that you can't pay back the principal, but you can pay back the interest payments. So essentially, over time, your payments will continue on because you're not paying down the original loan amount. So it'd be like paying only the debt that you've accrued through your credit card and never actually paying the amount that you spent, never paying that back. So the third type is Ponzi borrowing, and that is when you borrow money without the capacity to pay back the principal or the interest, and you're purely relying on the growth of the value of the asset that you're purchasing. So it'd be like if somebody bought a home and couldn't pay back the principal or the interest, but was relying on the increase in the value of the home for them to be able to, and a lot of this was going on actually during the housing crisis, during the '08 collapse. And so I believe, and this is just what I believe, I think the evidence shows that much of the latter half of the 20th century, the prosperity that came to be after the war economy of World War II was a Ponzi borrow. Basically, a massive expenditure of money by the government, and I'm sure lots of corporations were also involved, that was entirely reliant on the growth of the economy and the consumer model, and for people to keep buying. And you think about the programs that were put in place over the last 75 years, I don't really believe that there was true understanding of how they would be paid back in the long run. Maybe some people thought that there would be fiscal responsibility, but mostly this was kicked down the road. And we're at a point in time where growth is going to shutter and stop, particularly if people don't consume in the same ways that they have been. And a lot of the debt that has accumulated since the end of World War II that allowed the prosperity of the baby boom generation, a lot of that debt is coming due, both environmental debt and economic debt, during the millennial and Gen Z generations, during their formative years, right? So I think that it's probably the case that millennials and Gen Z in particular are going to have to shoulder a lot of the burden of fixing that and cleaning it up. And so there are lessons to be learned here, and one of them is that the older generations, the boomers, for example, they lived well, and they basically used the resources that were available to them at the time that they were growing up. And while I do agree that a lot of the overconsumption and intense reliance on growth was reckless and short-sighted, I'm not too sure that if we were in that position that we would have done anything different. Is sort of caught up in the upward cycle of it and thinking, well, somebody else will deal with that in the future. And I know that a lot of criticism goes towards the boomer generation for example, putting too much carbon into the atmosphere. Well, you know, their lives happen to coincide with the democratization of the automobile. And think about all the liberties that has afforded the generations that followed. And I don't exactly blame them for making that a central part in their life. It wasn't exactly clear at the time what was the risk involved in taking on this new invention, not new invention, but this new mass marketed version of it. And I think that millennials kid themselves when they say, okay, boomer, and they're dismissive. Obviously, there's a lot of things that are, it's frustrating that a lot of boomers don't exactly see that the prosperity that existed around their generation is unprecedented in world and American history. And they happen to be born into a moment where it was easier to get jobs, it was easier to and cheaper to get education, interest rates were favorable, um, companies were more loyal to employees and employees more loyal to companies. So it was a generally sort of ladder up in the company over time. You get the gold watch, you get the promotions. So I think that they believe, a lot of boomers believe that that is still the case. And a lot of that is purely what they grew up in. And unfortunately, a lot of people, there tends to be a sense of arrogance and I did this all by myself if they happen to have success. And while um, I don't deny that a tremendous amount of boomers worked incredibly hard through their entire lives, they were also presented with the opportunity to do so. So I think that what millennials need to do is realize that we're about to engage in a similar thing. Our consumption is going to be more technological and data based. Our assets are going to be more digital, I believe, than physical. And I think the amount of data and computing power that we consume and the amount of energy through screens that we have going simultaneously and the amount of digital junk that we create and forget about because it doesn't occupy an actual physical room is going to require tremendous amounts of energy that we are going to think is free and not taking energy because there's not visible smoke coming out of a smokestack somewhere. It's not a factory that's creating it. It's a massive server farm that takes untold amounts of energy. So our consumption is going to be as reckless as consumption was generations ago. We're just not going to see it as such because it's happening in our own time. So it's important to realize that. And I think it's also important for the older generation to realize that the same circumstance that allowed their prosperity is not what still exists right now. However, I think that younger people still need to have a sense of optimism in the sense of if they're totally convinced that no opportunity exists, then it will become self-fulfilling prophecy and they will be far more likely to fail and to not achieve what it is they want to achieve. So it's layered, it's nuanced. And I think the Ponzi borrow of the post-war years is starting to, I guess you could say that the chickens are coming home to roost. So we shall see how the generations work together to realize that effectively we're in this shit together and that the futures that are affected by college debt are intertwined with the futures that are affected by lack of retirement savings. So each generation might have animosity and might think that they can just section off their issues and not deal with and say to the others, hey, those are your problems. It's your bed. You made it, lay in it. But it's not that simple because when something like that festers, it eventually becomes your problem. The body under the floorboards, when it starts to rot and and becomes entirely noticeable, becomes everybody's problem. So the next thing that I wanted to talk about is there's really two more things, but it's called cubicle neurosis. That's a term of my invention. And what I mean by cubicle neurosis is a lot of people who occupy office jobs, desk jobs, cubicle jobs, they just get this sense of, is this it? Is this what I'm destined to do? Is to punch the digital time card and do something, create a spreadsheet, whatever, that really has no value and is not going to ultimately leave much of an impression on this company that I work for, the world. It's not really going to better much, and it's not going to leave me feeling any sense of meaning, purpose, anything like that. So we a lot of us go to our bullshit jobs, and it's almost like the movie Office Space, where we just mentally check out. We hang ourselves at the door, and we are this zombie person while we're at work during the day, right? So I think that a lot of people, it's probably a bit of a generational thing. Younger people, they say, I want more. I want a job that has meaning or purpose. I want a vocation that gives me a sense that I'm actually doing something or contributing something or making something better, rather than being stuck in a job where I'm clearly part of a malfunctioning institution or a corrupt organization, and I can't say anything about it because I'm relying on this job that I'm a part of for my income to support myself or my family. And if I simply wasn't so chained to this thing because of the benefits package that I have, which they're providing for me, then I would in an instant leave, do something that I prefer to do, and also out them for their corruption or this thing that they're doing that gets swept under the rug, or their hypocrisy, where they say in their mission statement they're all about, I don't know, work-life balance, and then they expect you immediately to not complain at all and to work as many hours because it's the standard operating procedure de facto. I think a lot of people are realizing the degree of bullshit, and they feel compressed in that they can't say anything about it, and it brings depression into their lives because they feel like they're fraudulent and that they're living a lie, and that they have to spend tremendous effort to pretend that it's not a lie, at least in public. And there's a lot of there's probably a lot of self-loathing that comes along with that, and a lot of pettiness between people that work in this in these office settings, where people realize that that a lot of it is bullshit or just for show. And it makes me think of a lot of things. Make me think of the Soviet Union, but I happen to be very interested, if you couldn't tell over the course of this podcast, in the 20th century. So Nazism, communism, these are recurring themes. But one of the things that made people so miserable in the Soviet Union was that they had to basically live under the pretense that what they were doing was working. So they had to live under this constant state of stress from the lie that they had to live and project into the world. And so it's like a constant state of confusion of I know this isn't real, but everybody has to pretend that it's real and that it's working, even though it's not, or, you know, that this utopian system is somehow making us happy when it's not. And also when you keep people in a constant state of confusion and suspicion, then they start to break down over time mentally. And it's tremendously, like, it's a low level of stress. It's basically fatigue. Like, I was an engineer at one point, a mechanical engineer, and fatigue is when you have stress over time, lower levels of stress, and that causes the material to fracture or malfunction. So that's what we're seeing is this fatigue of people having to keep up a charade, and also to, you know, like all to pretending all these seminars that they give a shit about, or that they're not total bullshit, or that these initiatives or these meetings, constant meetings or constant emails haven't basically crept in and made most of their job just communications about bullshit. So when you keep people in these low levels of stress over time constantly, it becomes the air that they breathe, then they effectively just, like I was saying, they break down. And it's unfortunate that people in their work environments are confused and really hating their jobs a lot of the time. And I think that really outside of work too, it's become that way too, where people feel like they can never really leave the bullshit, because you see it in society too, where everybody is afraid or suspicious of everybody else. They don't know what they can say. They don't know who's going to report them, ruin their reputation, ruin their job, whatever, because of, you know, social media's influence as well has made it easier to misspeak and be piled on. So this sense that you can never be authentically yourself is draining. And I think that most of us, most conscious humans that think and feel, are in pursuit of authenticity if they can get as close to it as possible. But a lot of us feel that we're just kept away from it, that there's a barrier between ever actually achieving it, because we have to get stuck at pretending that, in the pretense of pretending what we're doing is actually working or meaningful. So anyway, the term that I give it, which is cubicle neurosis, was inspired by the idea of a lot of younger people seeing all this, maybe not articulating it exactly as I said it, but thinking to themselves, I want something more than this. And older generations or other people saying, like, how entitled of you to ask for something more than that. You realize that you actually have a job, and that's more than can be said for most of the people in history who couldn't support themselves, who didn't have food, who didn't have resources, didn't have income, and a lot of people still today, right? And so in the book The Feminine Mystique, which was written by Betty Friedan, who was a second wave feminist, she talks about how in the 50s there was a condition termed housewife neurosis. And what was occurring was a lot of women who were confined to working in the home all day had this sense of incompleteness, of lack of fulfillment, of not actually doing anything of purpose, of not discovering what they were truly capable of. And that essentially came from being confined to a world where they had to take care of the children only and do cleaning, endless cleaning tasks only. And so the companies, the Madison Avenue advertisers, were always trying to come up with new advertisements to get housewives excited about new cleaning products and things like that. But you could only clean so much before you effectively had to wait for people to get things dirty again. And in the book, they talk about how a lot of housewives were actually hostile towards their own husbands and children for getting things dirty, when in reality that's just the nature of life over time. Entropy, right? Things just get dirtier. And then somebody has to put in the work to clean them up. So ultimately, all this cleaning in the expectation that they were supposed to dote on their children was unfulfilling. There was more that they could do. There was more energy that they could put towards other things that they found meaningful. And it actually, when there weren't other things that they were allowed to do or that it was considered proper for women to do, it took all day and tons of energy, and there was exhaustion from the cleaning tasks, when other women at the time who were involved in organizations, who were involved in maybe they had a job of their own, who were academically involved somehow, a lot of those women actually got the task done in a much smaller span of time. And it makes me think of, and that's because it's almost like a gas that expands to fill the container that it's in. That's what work can be like as well, is that if your work is confined to a narrow range of things, it can basically take all of your time to do it. And I think that's what a lot of burnt out office folk are dealing with today, where they're not really actually doing much. Like I mentioned before, they have to go through the pretense of looking like they're working, or they have to drag out a lot of mundaneness into a full day to make it look like a lot is being done, or to make it feel like a lot is being done, or to make it feel like they have essentially a value to the organization. So think about everybody always talking about how busy they are. A lot of people really aren't that busy, and I'm talking in the work context here, and they're just doing make work type stuff to make themselves look busy. So that same neurosis that came to be in the housewife, that dissatisfaction, that depression, that she wasn't pursuing her utmost of her capabilities, that exists with the modern office worker today. It's cubicle neurosis, and it now has a term. You can say that I coined that, and start using it, because it's rampant. It really is. And there starts to be actual damage to your, I know this sounds dramatic, but like actual damage to your soul over time, when you're just doing this thing that is ultimately meaningless to you. So I think that's really something to think about. I think that over the generations, if you think about Maslow's hierarchy of needs, if you don't know what that is, it's a concept from Psychology 101, basically, where this guy Maslow had this hierarchy of things that humans needed, and at the bottom was the basics like shelter and food, and then you would go up and there would be social needs right above that, and then esteem needs, which is how you felt about yourself. And there was belongingness. I think I'm mixing these up a little bit, but ultimately the top level is self-actualization. And self-actualization is pretty much like enlightenment. You think about a lot of the religions of the world, or the philosophies, or the spiritual ideas, and the end goal is like nirvana or enlightenment, or in this case, the psychological term, self-actualization. And I think that just as individuals strive to have confidence and security in each of those domains where they can climb up to the next one, I think generations do as well. And, maybe 5 generations ago or longer, it depends on where you are in the world, which country, but previous generations had to struggle for basic survival, for basic, it was sort of the Malthusian dilemma. Malthus, if you don't know what a Malthusian dilemma is, this guy Malthus, he was a population, I think he was not a demographer, but he was the guy that pre-Darwin was concerned about populations and that we would effectively consume all the resources, and then some development would occur, some innovation, and we would derive all the benefit from it, and then we right back to square one, where the population increased because of the invention, and then we would consume all of the new food or resources that came about because of the invention. And so yeah, with trying to think of why did I bring up this. It's getting late. So okay. Forgive me when I lose my thought. That happens time to time. So previous generations were trying to get their basic fundamentals like food, shelter, and then maybe the next generation they had that basics because of the work of their parents, and they could move up to focusing on the next level, which was social needs or esteem, belongingness, right? And then I think eventually we're sort of in a time of plenty right now, and a lot of this stuff has been previously established, and we build upon it and go to the next level, which is self-actualization. I think it's sort of like the natural evolution of human pursuit. And I don't think that people should be criticized for reaching for it, for striving for that. I think a lot of people will try to knock them down for pursuing something more meaningful, purposeful, and self-actualizing. Okay, so the last thing that I wanted to bring up, actually a perfect segue, because I was talking about generations. I've talked about it a couple times over the course of this episode. There's a book called The Fourth Turning, and I think it's so relevant right now. And it's actually Steve Bannon's, one of his favorite books, and one of the reasons that he based his policies when he was part of the Trump administration the way that he did. That's not why I like the book. It's just an interesting piece of trivia that provides context to this book. So the book is really about how generations differ over time. And it's written by Neil Howe and William Strauss. William Howe and Neil Strauss. One of those two combinations. And so I'm going to plug in the laptop. So the book starts out talking about the very concept of progress, and that's an entirely new conception. Originally, time was perceived to be chaotic, and things would happen randomly, and there was not really any explanation to it. And then after that was this idea of cyclical time, where things happened repeatedly, recurringly, and that came about during the particularly Industrial Revolution, when time became more relevant. Think about the rotations of clocks, the rotations of planets around the sun, the crop cycles. Everything was effectively cyclical. So, and even trends of history were seen to be cyclical. And it was only really recently, pretty much since the Industrial Revolution, that the idea of progress has come about, where time effectively advances linearly towards progress. And what the book talks about is how there's probably more cyclicality to human development than we think. And it's probably some combination of cyclical and linear, almost like how a bicycle, the cycles of the tires move the bike forward in a linear way. So history moves forward, but it does so through cycles. And what they talk about is the concept called a seculum, which is an 80 to 100-year period where essentially during the last 6 centuries, the Anglo-American seculums, meaning English and American, have been pretty consistent in their format. So there's been enough stability in English American history that they track it in this book. And each of these 80 to 100-year periods has a crisis, a high, an awakening, and an unraveling. So for 20 to 25-year periods that roughly correspond to the phases of life where you have childhood, and then adolescence, and then adulthood, and then elderhood. So it's also almost like the seasons of the year, where the first season is spring. You think of birth, budding trees, flowers, everything. And then summer, which is equivalent to adolescence, sort of coming into your own. And then adulthood, which is the fall, which is the harvest, where you start to reap a lot of your earlier investments of time and energy. And then you have winter, which is elderhood, where you have effectively death and rebirth on the other side of another generation. So, or of another of something else. So, what they talk about in how they relate this to the idea of progress in history is how the previous crises in the United States have been the Depression and World War II, the Civil War, the American Revolution, the Glorious Revolution, the Armada Crisis, and the War of Roses. And they happen pretty consistently every 80 to 100 years, a total conflict or an all-consuming issue of some kind. And we find ourselves right now at a point in history where we are in the fourth turning. A crisis ought to be occurring. So after a crisis, there is a high. That corresponds, the previous one was the period where the baby boomers were born, which was just after World War II, where things are starting to get better. There's much more civic trust. Institutions are being built. New ideas and new initiatives are being pursued. And it's an era of civic unity and togetherness. And after a high, you have an awakening where the stifling nature of the sort of one-mindedness and conformity of the high gets a backlash. And that was, you think about the whole protest movement, the Vietnam era, the Black rights movement, women rights movement, gay rights movement, all those things pushing back against this stifling monoculture, kind of conservative culture of the 50s and early 60s. So after in the basic idea is that at that point in time, the society might be materially well off or of one mind, but there's no, spiritually things have fallen apart, and there doesn't really seem to be much excitement to life. So the third phase is the unraveling, and that's really the phase that millennials would have been born into. And that is basically when individualism is at its peak and institutions are weakest. And let's see, I'm trying to remember, there was, I believe, pursuit of pleasure is high. Families tend to be at their lowest, or potentially marriage is at its lowest. and children start to become more coddled, which is interesting. That's certainly the millennial experience. Probably has led to peaks in anxiety. And interestingly enough, I brought this up in a previous episode, but I should have brought this up when I was just bringing up housewife neurosis. But the insistence that women had to have that strict role in the 50s meant that a lot of them were trying to live vicariously through their children and would basically overmother their children. And because of that, they didn't really give their children much opportunity to figure themselves out. And a lot of them grew up with intense anxiety and lack of resilience. Really, they became mama's boys and mama's girls, right? So it's interesting to think about how all these things play out across generations. And aside from the concept of history being partly cyclical, that I find fascinating, and a lot of people don't like this idea, or they criticize this book because they say it's overly deterministic, meaning humans, if things happen this way, then humans ultimately don't have a say in how history proceeds. That's actually not what it's saying. It's saying that these patterns exist and that our action and inaction affects the results. So while we're on, where we're sort of in this ocean and riding these waves, our decisions while we're navigating that ocean can determine whether we end up upside down or at our destination. So one of the most fascinating aspects of the fourth turning is the idea that when each generation is born, relative to what's going on in the cycle at that point, it imparts a certain generational character onto that generation. So the terms that they use to describe the generational characters in the book, what they term as archetypes, are if you're born during a high, like the baby boomers, you're a prophet generation. That's Prophet. If you're born during an awakening, then you are a nomad generation. So that would be Generation X. They were more independent. They were known, I'm not sure if you've heard the term latchkey before, but they were the latchkey kids who grew up during a time of high divorce rates where, they only lived with one parent, or both parents were working, and they would go home and they'd have to let themselves into the house with the key. It'd be under the carpet or something like that. So they were the latchkey kids. And interestingly enough, cinema, television at the time, media depicted families or depicted children as being evil, like devil children. You think of like Children of the Corn and It's Alive and a lot of these movies. The Omen. So things shifted back more towards and I believe rates of abortion were also pretty high at that point in time. And things shifted back towards highly protective of kids back during the next kids born during in unraveling, which is the millennials. So if you're born during an unraveling, you're a hero generation. And I know that doesn't sit well with a lot of people who find millennials endlessly irritating and self-serving. But I do believe, not just because I'm a millennial, but I do believe that millennials are misjudged. And yes, I think a lot of them are going to be effectively so caught up in themselves or so caught up in seeking social approval that they're not really going to be reliable contributors. But I think a lot of people are going to, a lot of millennials are going to step up and effectively realize that things need to be fixed. And if we don't start fixing them, then nobody will. And we're going to use the tools that are in our tool chest, which tend to be more technological, and fix and try to fix a lot of this stuff. And the previous generation that was of the hero archetype was the greatest generation, was the generation of our grandparents that stormed Normandy, the GI generation. And you have to realize that heroes aren't born, they're made. They were just normal people. They were misjudged as well. And then they were called upon to do something heroic. They were called upon to use their youthful energy to bring about a change. And first it was through the war effort. It was fighting the crisis. And then it was, or fighting in the crisis, I should say, or doing something about the crisis. And then it was afterward in establishing the new order that existed after the crisis. So these are what this is what hero generations do, basically. They use their youthful energy to combat the crisis and ultimately to bring society together again, and then to develop the new institutions and ideas that become the sort of the core that society starts to congregate around in the new high period. So I'm confident that we're in that right now. A lot of people just don't realize that we're in it because it just looks endlessly bleak to a lot of people who think that everything's going to fall apart. And what they don't realize is that we need cyclical crises to smash our institutions to bits so that we can gather up the most valuable pieces of those institutions and work new developments that have come about since over the last 80 to 100 years that have not been brought into the institutions yet, to sort of update them and reinvigorate society. As the authors say at one point, it's almost like the burning off of dead wood in the forest, or over the course of the winter, things effectively dying, and the phoenix rises from the ash. The phoenix rises from the ashes afterwards in the spring. And the final stage, the final generational archetype, is if you're born during a crisis, which is the artist archetype. And it's the Gen Z generation today. And previously it was the silent generation who was born during World War II and the Great Depression. So you can actually track the progress of these generational archetypes through each phase of the cycle. And it's pretty damn fascinating to actually think about history in this way, as if there is some type of structure that exists that we don't actually realize. Some type of, let's say, enthusiasm or momentum of mass groups of people that kind of carries us through time and helps to explain some of these events that occur. And once again, we're not condemned to live entirely by this theory, but I don't know, it kind of frees us in some way, and also allows us to plan by, and I don't know, it allows us to plan for the cyclicality to an extent, with the hope, my hope being that, yes, the pendulum is going to continue to swing. We're still going to have these cycles, but we can reduce the severity of the swing over time. So, you know, the degree of the crisis doesn't have to be as massive, and we can actually start to come together and plan for the crisis before the crisis starts to happen. We can dampen the impact of the crises. Now, I'm not exactly sure how knowledge of these cycles will impact the cycles, because there's something called the second order chaotic system, where knowledge of the system itself and how it works impacts how the system functions. So an example is a first order chaotic system is like the weather, where it's hyper complex and there's so many variables, but as you learn how those variables interact with each other, your knowledge of it doesn't actually affect how that system functions. A second order chaotic system is like the economy, where as you figure out all the different factors that contribute towards how the economy works, the understanding of how they work is then going to be used to try to outsmart the economic system and gain leverage over it, which is then going to shift how the system works to begin with. So it's like constantly moving away. As you learn more about it, you're going to have to constantly keep learning, and it's going to keep shifting. So just keep all of this in mind. I'm trying to tie these disparate ideas together, and it's not I'm not trying to build a perfect narrative. I'm just trying to say that knowledge is very hyper complex and nuanced and interconnected. So I'll try to intersperse my conversations with references and where you can find the information that I am referring to. So the last thing that I think I'll really talk about next time is, I talked in the previous episode, the race thing, about Thomas Sowell's book, Black Rednecks and White Liberals. Just so fascinating and relevant right now. But I really wanted to talk about the state of education next time. And the connection to that book would be the state of Black education. And that sounds sort of like a weird phrase, but effectively there at one point in time, because a lot of Blacks in the United States lag behind whites and Asians, and this has been a constant battle since the civil rights movement to try to basically equalize educational and economic outcomes, right? So in this book, Thomas Sowell talks about how back in the 50s, there was a school called the Dunbar School, which produced tons of highly successful Black students, scholars, who went on to incredible success, and it all concentrated on largely this one school. And we've really abandoned a lot of the methods and the ideas that were used by that school, and it's been to the detriment of Black education. And when I say Black education, I'm not differentiating the content of the education. I'm just simply saying that one of the goals is to try to bring different groups in society in a multicultural, multiracial, multi-religious, multi-everything society to all experience success, have an opportunity at success. So I'm going to talk about education next time, and I'm going to talk more about Thomas Sowell's Black Rednecks and White Liberals. So stay tuned. If you have any questions for me or any recommendations of topics, let me know. And like I said at the beginning of the episode, my plan is to get back to actually having conversations with people again soon. Hopefully next episode. Well, actually, maybe the next episode about education will be with somebody. So that'll be my goal. If you want to talk with me about it, let me know. So that's it for tonight. Thanks for listening. Bye, everybody.